March 13th, 1964. 3:15 in the morning. In the quiet residential neighborhood of Kew Gardens, Queens, a young woman's desperate cry for help pierced the darkness. "Oh my God, he stabbed me. Please help me." The scream shattered the pre-dawn silence of Austin Street, where middle-class families slept peacefully behind the windows of their Tudor-style apartment buildings. For 28-year-old Catherine Kitty Genovese, these final moments would transform her from an ordinary bar manager into the center of one of America's most disturbing psychological case studies. But this isn't just a story about murder. This is a story about human nature itself, about the invisible forces that can turn neighbors into strangers, witnesses into ghosts, and a community into a collection of individuals who choose to look away when courage demands they look closer. The events that unfolded that March morning would expose something so unsettling about modern urban life that it would spawn decades of psychological research, reshape how we understand human behavior in crisis situations, and force an entire nation to confront an uncomfortable truth about itself. If cases like this fascinate you, subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, where every mystery has a ticking timeline waiting to be uncovered. Kitty Genovese was returning home from her job managing Ev's 11th Hour bar in Hollis, Queens. She had parked her red Fiat in the Long Island Railroad parking lot, just 100 feet from her apartment building at 82-70 Austin Street. It was a routine she had followed countless times before, the short walk from car to front door that should have taken less than 2 minutes. The Kew Gardens neighborhood prided itself on safety. Tree-lined streets, well-maintained buildings, and a close-knit community of working professionals who knew each other by sight, if not by name. This was the kind of place where people moved to escape the chaos of Manhattan, where children played outside without fear, where violent crime was something that happened somewhere else to someone else. Winston Mosley had been driving through Queens for hours that night, hunting. The 29-year-old machine operator from South Ozone Park had left his wife and 2 children sleeping at home while he prowled the streets in his white Corvair, searching for a victim. He had already attempted one attack earlier that evening, but had been scared off when his intended target screamed. Now, as Kitty Genovese walked alone through the darkness toward her apartment, Mosley spotted her. She was small, alone, and vulnerable, exactly what he had been looking for. The apartment buildings that lined Austin Street stood like silent sentinels in the darkness, their windows dark except for the occasional glow of a late-night television or reading lamp. Behind those windows lived 38 people who would soon face a moral test that would define not just their own characters, but challenge fundamental assumptions about human decency and civic responsibility. What happened next would take 35 minutes to unfold. 35 minutes that would be dissected, analyzed, and debated for decades to come. 35 minutes that would introduce the world to a psychological phenomenon that would bear Kitty's name, the bystander effect, also known as Genovese syndrome. The attack began with Mosley following Kitty as she walked from the parking lot toward her building. She noticed him approaching and quickened her pace, her heels clicking rapidly against the pavement. Something about his presence triggered her survival instincts, perhaps the way he moved, or simply a woman's intuitive sense of danger in the pre-dawn darkness. As she reached the front of her building, Mosley caught up to her. What followed was not a quick, silent crime, but a prolonged, brutal assault that would test every assumption about human nature, community responsibility, and the social contract that binds us together. The first scream that echoed through Austin Street that March morning was just the beginning. It was a cry that would awaken neighbors, illuminate windows, and set in motion a series of choices that would haunt a community, challenge the conscience of a nation, and ultimately reveal something profoundly disturbing about the human condition. In the apartment buildings surrounding the scene, lights began to flick on, curtains twitched, faces appeared at windows, and in that moment, 38 ordinary people found themselves thrust into an extraordinary situation that would test the very limits of human decency. Catherine Susan Genovese was born into a world of possibility on July 7, 1935, in Brooklyn, New York. To her family and friends, she was simply Kitty, a nickname that captured her spirited, independent nature and the warmth that drew people to her like moths to a flame. The youngest of 5 children born to Vincent and Rachel Genovese, Kitty grew up in a tight-knit Italian-American family where Sunday dinners were sacred, Loyalty was everything, and hard work was the pathway to the American dream. Her father worked as a coat presser in Brooklyn's garment district, while her mother managed the household with the iron discipline that kept 5 children in line during the Great Depression and World War II. From an early age, Kitty displayed the kind of restless energy that couldn't be contained by conventional expectations. While her siblings followed more traditional paths, she possessed an adventurous spirit that would eventually lead her away from the familiar streets of Brooklyn toward the promise of independence in Queens. At just 28 years old, Kitty had already lived more fully than many people twice her age. She had moved out of her family home, carved out her own space in the world, and built a life that reflected her values of hard work, loyalty, and fierce independence. Those who knew her described a young woman who lit up rooms with her presence, who could make strangers feel like old friends, and who approached life with an optimism that was both infectious and inspiring. Her job managing Ev's 11th Hour Bar in Hollis was more than just employment. It was a testament to her ability to connect with people from all walks of life. In an era when women rarely managed businesses, especially bars, Kitty had earned the trust and respect of both her employer and the diverse clientele who frequented the establishment. She had a gift for remembering names, listening to problems, and creating the kind of welcoming atmosphere that turned a simple bar into a community gathering place. But Kitty's life was complicated by the social realities of 1964 America. She was living with her partner, Mary and Zilonko, in their shared apartment at 82-70 Austin Street, a relationship that required discretion in an era when homosexuality was not just socially stigmatized but legally prohibited. Their love existed in the shadows, known only to their closest friends and carefully hidden from a world that was not yet ready to accept it. This hidden aspect of her identity added layers of complexity to Kitty's already independent nature. She had learned to navigate a world where authenticity came with risks, where being true to herself meant living with constant awareness of social boundaries and legal dangers. Yet those who knew her best saw no contradiction between her public warmth and her private caution. Both were expressions of a woman who understood that survival sometimes required strategic choices. The Kew Gardens neighborhood where Kitty chose to make her home represented everything she valued about urban life. It offered the anonymity of the city combined with the safety of a suburban community. Here, she could be herself without the scrutiny that might come in a smaller town, while still enjoying the security that came from living among educated, professional neighbors. Her daily routine reflected the discipline that had carried her from her childhood in Brooklyn to her independent life in Queens. She would leave for work each evening, spend hours managing a bar and serving customers, then make the short drive home in her red Fiat, usually arriving between 2:30 and 3 in the morning. It was a schedule that suited her night owl personality and allowed her to maintain the kind of work-life balance that supported both her professional responsibilities and her personal relationships. Those who worked with her at Ev's 11th Hour described Kitty as someone who genuinely cared about people, the kind of manager who remembered when employees were having family troubles, who would stay late to help clean up, who treated everyone with the same basic dignity regardless of their station in life. Regular customers knew they could count on her for a sympathetic ear, a fair drink, and the kind of honest conversation that made their problems seem more manageable. Her relationship with Mary and provided the emotional anchor that allowed her to navigate the complexities of her public and private lives. Together, they had created a home that reflected their shared values, a space filled with books, music, and the comfortable domesticity that spoke to their commitment to building a life together despite the social obstacles they faced. On the night of March 13th, Kitty was simply returning home from another shift at the bar, carrying with her the small satisfactions that came from a job well done and the anticipation of reuniting with a woman she loved. She had no way of knowing that her routine journey, from parking lot to apartment door, would become the final chapter of a life that had been defined by independence, courage, and an unwavering commitment to living authentically in a world that demanded conformity. Winston Mosley should have been home sleeping beside his wife Betty, their 2 young children safe in their beds down the hall of their modest house in South Ozone Park. Instead, he was prowling the dark streets of Queens in his white Chevrolet Corvair, driven by urges he would later describe with chilling matter-of-factness to police investigators. At 29 years old, Mosley lived what appeared to be an unremarkable suburban life. He worked as a machine operator at Rico Manhattan Incorporated, earned a steady paycheck, and maintained the facade of a devoted family man. His neighbors knew him as quiet and polite, the kind of man who kept his lawn trimmed and never caused trouble. To the outside world, Winston Mosley was the embodiment of 1960s respectability. But beneath this carefully constructed exterior lurked something far more sinister. For months, Mosley had been feeding a growing compulsion that demanded increasingly dangerous outlets. What had begun as voyeurism, peering through windows, following women home, had escalated into something far more predatory. The thrill of watching was no longer enough. He needed more. This wasn't his first night hunt. Mosley had been systematically cruising through Queens neighborhoods for weeks, studying patterns, identifying vulnerable targets, and refining his approach. He had learned which streets offered the best escape routes, which areas had the least police patrol activity, and most importantly, which types of victims were least likely to be missed immediately. His method was methodical and calculating. He would drive slowly through residential areas in the early morning hours, when most people were asleep but shift workers and late-night employees might still be returning home. He looked for women alone, preferably small in stature, walking from parking areas to apartment buildings, where screams might go unheard or ignored. Earlier that very evening, Mosley had attempted an attack in the Lefrak City housing complex in Corona, Queens. He had followed a young woman from her car, but when she screamed, lights came on in nearby apartments and he fled. The failure only intensified his need to find another victim, someone more isolated, in a location where he could complete what he had started. The psychology that drove Winston Mosley would fascinate criminal experts for decades to come. This wasn't a crime of passion or desperation. It was the calculated behavior of a predator who had learned to compartmentalize his violent impulses from his daily life. He could kiss his wife goodbye, tuck his children into bed, and then slip out into the night to hunt human prey. What made Mosley particularly dangerous was his patience and adaptability. When his first attempt failed, he didn't give up or return home. Instead, he simply drove to another neighborhood, reset his strategy, and continued searching. This persistence, combined with his ability to appear non-threatening to potential victims, created a deadly combination. As he cruised through Kew Gardens in the early morning hours of March 13th, Mosley was operating with the confidence of someone who had successfully evaded detection multiple times before. He understood that most people were reluctant to get involved in situations that didn't directly concern them, especially in urban environments where minding one's own business was considered a survival strategy. The Austin Street area appealed to him for several tactical reasons. The apartment buildings were close enough together that residents might hear disturbances, but far enough apart that witnesses would be observing from a distance. The parking lot was separated from the apartment entrances by enough space that he would have time to act before potential victims could reach safety. Most importantly, it was a neighborhood where people knew each other just well enough to recognize faces, but not well enough to feel compelled to intervene in each other's problems. When Mosley spotted Kitty Genovese walking alone from the Long Island Railroad parking lot toward her apartment building, he saw exactly what he had been searching for. She was small, alone, and focused on getting home safely, unaware that she was being stalked by someone who had already decided she would be his victim. He began following her slowly in his Corvair, maintaining enough distance to avoid arousing suspicion while staying close enough to act quickly when the opportunity presented itself. As he watched her walk briskly toward her building, Mosley was already calculating his approach, anticipating her likely reactions, and preparing for the violence he was about to unleash. The predator had found his prey. What happened next would reveal not just the depths of one man's evil, but the capacity of an entire community to become passive observers to unspeakable brutality. For Winston Mosley, this was simply another night hunt. For Kitty Genovese, it was the final minutes of a life that had been defined by independence and courage. And for 38 witnesses who would soon be watching from their windows, it was a test of human decency that most of them would fail catastrophically. The attack began with footsteps on pavement, the sound of Winston Mosley abandoning his Corvair and pursuing Kitty Genovese on foot as she hurried toward the safety of her apartment building. She had sensed his presence, felt the primitive warning that every woman knows when danger approaches in the darkness. Kitty quickened her pace, her heels clicking rapidly against the concrete as she covered the remaining distance to 82 to 70, Austin Street. Behind her, Mosley moved with the determined stride of a predator who had already committed to violence. There would be no changing his mind, no last-minute retreat. He had chosen his victim, and now he would claim her. As she reached the front of her building, desperation drove Kitty to run. But Mosley was faster, stronger, and had the advantage of surprise. He caught up to her near the entrance, grabbing her from behind with brutal efficiency. This was the moment he had been fantasizing about during his long nights of hunting, the instant when watching transformed into action. The first blow came without warning. Mosley's hunting knife found its target, slicing into Kitty's back as she struggled to break free from his grip. The pain was immediate and shocking, but her survival instincts kicked in with fierce intensity. She wasn't going to die quietly in the darkness. She was going to fight, and she was going to scream. "Oh my God, he stabbed me. Please help me." The cry that erupted from Kitty's lungs carried across Austin Street with the force of pure terror and desperate hope. It was a sound that would haunt those who heard it for the rest of their lives. The voice of a young woman who believed, even in her darkest moment, that her neighbors would come to her aid. The scream had its intended effect. Lights began flicking on in apartment windows throughout the Tudor-style buildings that lined the street. Curtains twitched as residents awakened to the sound of violence unfolding outside their doors. For a brief moment, the darkness was punctuated by the warm glow of bedroom lamps and living room fixtures as ordinary people found themselves thrust into an extraordinary situation. In apartment 7W of 82 to 62, Austin Street, Robert Moser heard Kitty's cry and reacted with the kind of instinctive courage that would later make him one of the few heroes in this story. He threw open his window and shouted into the darkness, "Let that girl alone." His voice carried the authority of someone who believed that communities had an obligation to protect their own. The effect on Winston Mosley was immediate. The predator who had been operating with calculated confidence suddenly found himself exposed and vulnerable. This wasn't part of his plan. He had expected to work in the shadows, to complete his attack before anyone could react. The unexpected intervention shattered his sense of control and sent him fleeing toward his waiting corvair. But for Kitty Genovese, Robert Moser's brave intervention came too late to prevent the attack, though early enough to interrupt it. She had already been stabbed twice, the knife wound sending searing pain through her body and warm blood flowing down her back. Yet she was alive, conscious, and still fighting for survival. As Mosley disappeared into the darkness, Kitty struggled to assess her situation. The immediate danger had passed, but she was seriously injured and needed medical attention. More importantly, she needed to get inside her building, where she would be safe from her attacker's return. With tremendous effort, she began making her way around the building toward the rear entrance, where she hoped to find sanctuary. The residents who had been awakened by her screams faced their own moment of decision. They had heard the cry for help, witnessed the confrontation, and seen the attacker flee. Now they had to choose whether to venture outside to help an injured neighbor, call the police, or simply turn off their lights and return to bed. Most chose the latter option. The lights that had flickered on in response to Kitty's screams began going out one by one, as residents decided that the danger had passed and their involvement was no longer necessary. The brief moment of community response faded back into the darkness, leaving Kitty alone with her injuries and her desperate need for help. What none of the witnesses understood in that moment was that Winston Mosley hadn't given up. He was sitting in his car several blocks away, waiting and watching, his rage intensified by the humiliation of being scared away from his victim. The interruption hadn't ended his attack. It had only created a brief intermission in a brutal drama that was far from over. For 10 minutes, the Austin Street area settled back into an uneasy quiet. Residents convinced themselves that whatever had happened was finished, that normal life could resume. But Winston Mosley was not a man who accepted defeat easily. He had invested too much in this hunt to simply walk away empty-handed. As the neighborhood lights went out and the windows closed, the predator began his return journey, determined to finish what he had started. In the 10 minutes that followed Winston Mosley's retreat, an eerie calm settled over Austin Street. Behind the darkened windows of the Tudor apartment buildings, 38 people grappled with what they had witnessed and what they should do about it. Their individual decisions during these crucial minutes would ultimately define one of the most studied cases of collective moral failure in American history. Carl Ross, a resident of 82 to 70, Austin Street, the same building where Kitty lived, had been awakened by her screams. From his window, he had a clear view of the parking area where the attack occurred. He watched Mosley flee, saw Kitty struggling to move, and then made a choice that would haunt him forever. He turned off his light and went back to bed. Across the street, married couple Andre and Pierre Pic had been among the first to respond to the commotion. Andre had looked out their window just in time to see a man standing over a woman who was lying on the ground. The scene was illuminated clearly enough that she could make out details. Yet when her husband suggested calling the police, she hesitated. "We don't want to get involved," she whispered, echoing a sentiment that was being repeated throughout the neighborhood. The psychology of bystander intervention was playing out in real time across multiple apartments. Residents were experiencing what researchers would later identify as diffusion of responsibility, the phenomenon where individuals assume someone else will take action, thereby absolving themselves of the need to intervene. With so many potential witnesses, each person convinced themselves that surely someone else was handling the situation. In apartment after apartment, the same conversation was taking place. Couples debated whether they should call police. Single residents wondered if they had really seen what they thought they had seen, and parents worried about getting their families involved in something dangerous. The urban instinct for self-preservation battled against basic human decency, and in most cases, self-preservation won. What made the situation even more tragic was that many of the witnesses were decent, law-abiding citizens who would normally consider themselves moral people. They weren't criminals or sociopaths. They were teachers, shop owners, office workers, and retirees who had simply been caught off guard by a situation that demanded immediate moral courage they weren't prepared to provide. The apartment building layouts contributed to the psychological distance between witnesses and victim. Most observers were looking down from second or third floor windows, creating both literal and metaphorical separation from the violence below. This physical distance made it easier to rationalize an action. They were observers, not participants, watching something that felt almost cinematic in its unreality. Meanwhile, Kitty Genovese was fighting for her life in ways her neighbors couldn't fully comprehend. Seriously wounded but still conscious, she had managed to make her way around to the back of the building, leaving a trail of blood on the pavement. The knife wounds in her back were deep and painful, but her primary concern was finding safety before her attacker returned. She reached the rear entrance of her building and discovered it was locked. With her keys somewhere on the ground near the scene of the attack, she was trapped outside, vulnerable and bleeding. The back entrance led to a small vestibule area that would provide some concealment, but offered no real security if Mosley decided to continue his hunt. From her position near the rear door, Kitty could see the lights in neighboring apartments, evidence that people were awake, aware, and theoretically available to help. But no one was coming. No sirens wailed in the distance. No concerned neighbors appeared with flashlights or first aid. The community that should have rallied to protect one of its own had instead chosen the path of willful blindness. The silence was broken only by the sound of her own labored breathing and the distant hum of late-night traffic on Queens Boulevard. Each passing minute brought the growing realization that she was truly alone in this fight for survival. The social contract that supposedly bound neighbors together in mutual protection had dissolved the moment it was truly tested. What Kitty couldn't know was that Winston Mosley was still in the area, watching and waiting. He had driven only a few blocks away before parking and considering his options. The interruption had embarrassed him, but it hadn't diminished his determination to complete the attack. If anything, the brief setback had intensified his resolve. From his position several blocks away, Mosley could see that the neighborhood had returned to darkness and quiet. The lights that had come on during the initial attack were now off. The windows that had briefly opened were now closed. To his predatory mind, this was a clear signal that the coast was clear for him to return and finish what he had started. The residents of Austin Street had sent a message with their silence and inaction, though it wasn't the message they intended. They had communicated to both victim and attacker that this was not a community that would intervene, not a neighborhood where violence would be met with collective resistance. Winston Moseley received that message loud and clear. It was time for him to return. At approximately 3:25 in the morning, Winston Moseley made his decision. The neighborhood had fallen silent, the lights had gone out, and the brief moment of community response had dissolved into indifferent darkness. In his twisted logic, this was permission to continue. He started his Corvair and began the short drive back to Austin Street. Kitty Genovese had managed to reach the rear entrance of her building, but her situation had grown increasingly desperate. The locked door meant she remained exposed and vulnerable, her injuries bleeding freely as shock began to set in. She had tried calling out for help, but her voice was growing weaker, and the surrounding apartments remained stubbornly silent. From her position in the rear vestibule, she could hear the approach of a car engine. The sound sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the March cold. Some primitive part of her brain recognized the threat returning, even before she could see the white Corvair pulling into the parking area. Moseley parked his car and sat for a moment, surveying the scene with the calculating patience of a predator who had learned from his earlier mistake. This time, there would be no rushed approach, no sloppy execution that could be interrupted by a shouting neighbor. He would be thorough, methodical, and final. He stepped out of his car and began searching for his victim. The blood trail led him around the building like a gruesome roadmap, confirming what he already suspected. Kitty Genovese was wounded but still alive, still within his reach. The hunt wasn't over. It was simply entering its second phase. When he found her crouched near the back entrance, barely conscious and unable to run, Moseley felt the surge of power that came with absolute control over another human being. She looked up at him with eyes that reflected not just fear, but the crushing realization that no help was coming. The neighbors who should have protected her had abandoned her to this monster. "Please," she whispered, the word carrying the weight of every hope and prayer she had left. But Winston Moseley was not a man moved by pleas for mercy. If anything, her vulnerability only excited him further. The second attack was even more brutal than the first. Without the time pressure that had constrained his initial assault, Moseley was able to indulge his violent fantasies fully. The knife found its target repeatedly as Kitty's desperate attempts at self-defense grew weaker with each passing second. Her screams during this second assault were different from the first, weaker, more desperate, carrying the sound of someone who understood that death was approaching. These cries for help should have mobilized every decent person within earshot, should have sent neighbors rushing to their phones to call police, should have prompted at least one person to grab a baseball bat and come running. Instead, the response was exactly what it had been 10 minutes earlier. Lights flickering on briefly, curtains twitching, and then the deliberate choice to turn away. The witnesses who had failed to act during the first attack now failed again, their earlier inaction making the second failure somehow easier to rationalize. Carl Ross, whose apartment was closest to the rear entrance where the second attack was taking place, later admitted to investigators that he heard everything. The sounds of struggle, the victim's weakening cries, the obvious sounds of someone being murdered just outside his building. Yet he remained in his apartment, paralyzed by the same mixture of fear and indifference that had infected the entire neighborhood. But Moseley wasn't finished. After stabbing Kitty multiple times, he began to sexually assault her as she lay dying on the cold pavement. This wasn't just murder. It was a complete dehumanization of another person, the ultimate expression of the evil that had been hiding behind his suburban facade. During this final degradation, Kitty Genovese fought consciousness, her mind drifting between awareness and the merciful darkness that would soon claim her. In her final moments, she might have wondered why no one had come, why the social bonds that should have protected her had proven so fragile when tested by real evil. The attack continued for several more minutes, with Moseley taking his time to fully satisfy his violent impulses. When he was finally finished, Kitty Genovese was beyond help, her life bleeding away on the pavement behind a building full of people who had chosen to remain safely hidden behind their locked doors. As Moseley prepared to leave the scene for the final time, he took a moment to search through Kitty's belongings. He found $49 in her wallet and pocketed the money, adding robbery to his list of crimes. Even in death, Kitty Genovese was being victimized by the man who had destroyed her life. Winston Moseley drove away from Austin Street that morning knowing that he had committed the perfect crime. He had murdered a young woman in full view and hearing of dozens of witnesses, yet none of them had intervened effectively enough to save her life or identify him as the perpetrator. Behind him, he left a community that would soon be forced to confront the ugly truth about itself, and a victim whose name would become synonymous with one of the darkest aspects of human nature. At 3:50 in the morning, the silence that had settled over Austin Street was finally broken, not by the arrival of help, but by the discovery of a tragedy that could have been prevented. A neighbor walking to work stumbled upon Kitty Genovese's body in the rear vestibule of 82-70 Austin Street and immediately called the police. When the first patrol car arrived at 3:55, officers found a scene that would haunt them for years to come. Kitty lay in a pool of her own blood, her life stolen by a violence so savage that even hardened New York City cops struggled to process what they were seeing. The brutality was evident, but what would soon shock them even more was learning how many people had witnessed parts of this attack without calling for help. Detective Mitchell Sang was among the first investigators on the scene. As he began documenting the evidence and interviewing potential witnesses, a disturbing picture began to emerge. Building by building, apartment by apartment, he discovered that dozens of people had heard Kitty's screams, seen portions of the attack, or witnessed Winston Moseley fleeing the scene. The initial police canvass revealed something that defied belief. 38 residents of the Austin Street area had some knowledge of the attack as it was happening. They had heard the screams that pierced the pre-dawn darkness. They had seen the struggle between attacker and victim. They had watched Moseley flee after the first assault, then return to complete his deadly work. Yet not one of them had called the police during the attack itself. Carl Ross, who lived in Kitty's own building and had the clearest view of the final assault, finally made a phone call, but only after first calling a friend in Nassau County to ask for advice about whether he should get involved. Even then, his call to authorities came too late to save Kitty's life. She had been dead for minutes by the time he finally summoned the courage to pick up the phone. The interviews conducted by police revealed a catalog of rationalizations that would become textbook examples of bystander apathy. "I didn't want to get involved," was the most common refrain, followed closely by, "I thought someone else had already called," and "I wasn't sure what I was seeing." Some witnesses claimed they thought they were watching a domestic dispute between a man and woman who knew each other. Others insisted the distance and darkness made it impossible to understand the true nature of what was unfolding. Several admitted they had considered calling police, but hesitated long enough for the moment of moral courage to pass. Robert Moser, the man whose shout had temporarily scared off Moseley during the first attack, emerged as the only resident who had attempted any form of intervention. His brief moment of courage had likely saved Kitty's life temporarily, but the follow-through from the community never came. After scaring off the attacker, Moser had assumed the danger was over and returned to bed without calling authorities. The psychology behind these failures would fascinate researchers for decades to come. These weren't evil people or hardened criminals who had ignored Kitty's plight. They were teachers, shop owners, office workers, and retirees. Ordinary citizens who considered themselves moral, law-abiding members of society. Yet when confronted with a situation that demanded immediate moral courage, they had collectively failed in ways that seemed almost impossible to comprehend. How could 38 people witness a murder and do nothing effective to prevent it? The answer lay in a complex web of urban psychology, social dynamics, and individual rationalization that researchers would later term the bystander effect. In groups, individuals often experience a diffusion of responsibility that makes them less likely to act than they would be alone. The presence of other potential helpers actually decreases the likelihood that any single person will provide assistance. Each witness assumed someone else was handling the situation. Each person convinced themselves that they hadn't seen enough to be sure what was happening. Each individual found reasons why their specific circumstances made them unable to act effectively. The tragic irony was that if any one of these 38 people had called police immediately when Kitty's screams first pierced the night air, she would almost certainly have survived. A prompt response during the first attack would have prevented Moseley's return and saved her life. Instead, Their collective inaction had created the perfect conditions for murder. Winston Moseley had been able to attack, retreat, wait, return, and complete his deadly work because an entire community had chosen passive observation over active intervention. The discovery of so many witnesses transformed what might have been a routine murder investigation into something much larger and more disturbing. This wasn't just about catching one killer. It was about understanding how an entire neighborhood could become complicit in murder through their collective silence. As news of the 38 witnesses began to spread beyond the immediate investigation, it would spark a national conversation about urban alienation, moral responsibility, and the social contract that binds communities together. America was about to confront some uncomfortable truths about itself, and Kitty Genovese's name would become forever linked with questions that struck at the heart of human nature itself. The investigation had found its killer's trail, but it had also uncovered something far more unsettling. Evidence that in modern urban America, a person could be murdered in front of dozens of witnesses and die completely alone. The investigation into Kitty Genovese's murder began as a routine homicide case, but quickly evolved into something that would challenge fundamental assumptions about urban life and human nature. Detective Mitchell Sang and his team at the 102nd Precinct had solved countless murders before, but never one that involved so many witnesses who had done so little to help. The forensic evidence painted a clear picture of sustained brutality. Kitty had been stabbed 17 times, with wounds to her hands indicating she had fought desperately to defend herself. The blood trail told the story of her desperate attempt to reach safety, while the positioning of her body confirmed that Winston Moseley had returned to complete his savage work. But it was the witness interviews that transformed this case from a local tragedy into a national scandal. Detective Sang methodically worked his way through the apartment buildings surrounding Austin Street, knocking on doors and asking residents what they had seen or heard during the early morning hours of March 13th. What emerged from these conversations was a timeline of collective moral failure that seemed almost impossible to believe. The first screams had awakened witnesses at 3:15. Robert Moser's intervention had occurred around 3:20. Moseley's return and second attack had begun at 3:25. Yet the first call to police didn't come until 3:55, 40 minutes after Kitty's initial cry for help. The witnesses themselves seemed stunned when confronted with the implications of their inaction. Many had convinced themselves that they hadn't really understood what was happening, that the situation wasn't as serious as it appeared, or that someone else had surely already called for help. When Detective Sang explained that no one had called police until after Kitty was already dead, the weight of their collective failure began to sink in. Carl Ross, whose apartment window provided the clearest view of the final attack, became a particular focus of the investigation. He admitted to hearing Kitty's screams, seeing the assault, and even witnessing Moseley sexually assault her as she lay dying. Yet his first instinct had been to call a friend in Nassau County for advice about whether he should get involved in a domestic dispute. The friend had told him he should probably call police, but by the time Ross finally made that call, Kitty Genovese had been dead for several minutes. His delay, born of the same urban instinct for non-involvement that had infected the entire neighborhood, had cost a young woman her life. As the investigation expanded, police began searching for the killer himself. The witness descriptions of the attacker were remarkably consistent: a medium-height black man driving a white Corvair. Several residents had gotten clear enough views to provide detailed descriptions, yet none had thought to write down the license plate number or follow the vehicle as it fled. The breakthrough came not from the Austin Street witnesses, but from an unrelated incident that occurred 6 days after Kitty's murder. Winston Moseley was caught attempting to steal a television from a Yonkers home and was arrested by local police. During questioning, he began confessing to a series of crimes that went far beyond simple burglary. With chilling matter-of-factness, Moseley admitted to raping and killing Kitty Genovese, describing details of the attack that only the perpetrator could have known. But his confessions didn't stop there. He revealed that he had committed 2 other murders in the Bronx and Queens, along with numerous rapes, robberies, and burglaries that had terrorized the area for months. The man who had destroyed Kitty's life was not an impulsive killer driven by passion or desperation. He was a methodical predator who had been systematically hunting victims throughout New York City. His confession revealed the calculated nature of his crimes and his complete lack of remorse for the suffering he had inflicted. When news of Mosley's arrest and confession broke, it should have provided closure for the Austin Street community. Instead, it intensified the scrutiny on the 38 witnesses who had failed to save Kitty's life. The media coverage that followed would make their names public, and their inaction a matter of national debate. The story that emerged was one that challenged comfortable assumptions about urban communities and individual moral responsibility. These witnesses weren't monsters or sociopaths. They were ordinary people who had been confronted with an extraordinary situation and found themselves lacking the courage to act. Reporter Martin Gansberg of the New York Times would later write the definitive account of the case, with a headline that burned itself into the American consciousness. 37 who saw murder didn't call the police. The article, which ran on the front page on March 27, 1964, introduced the nation to a phenomenon that seemed to epitomize everything wrong with modern urban life. The investigation had not only caught a killer, but had also exposed something deeply troubling about the social fabric of American cities. In an era when communities were supposed to look out for each other, 38 people had watched a young woman die and done nothing effective to save her. The questions raised by the investigation would resonate far beyond the borders of Queens, forcing Americans everywhere to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and their communities. The New York Times article that ran on March 27, 1964, landed on breakfast tables across America like a moral bomb. 37 who saw murder didn't call the police, read the headline that would reshape how an entire nation understood itself. Reporter Martin Gansberg's carefully researched account of the Kitty Genovese murder introduced Americans to a phenomenon that seemed to capture everything troubling about modern urban life. The public reaction was immediate and explosive. Letters poured into newspaper offices from coast to coast, expressing outrage, disbelief, and soul-searching questions about what kind of society America had become. How could 37 people, later corrected to 38, witness a murder and fail to act? What did this say about the moral fabric of the nation? Editorial writers struggled to find adequate language to express their horror at the collective inaction. The case has become a symbol of urban apathy, wrote one columnist. If we cannot count on our neighbors to help us in our darkest hour, what hope is there for civilization itself? The Austin Street witnesses found themselves transformed from private citizens into national symbols of everything that was wrong with modern American society. Religious leaders seized on the case as evidence of spiritual decay in urban America. Sermons across the country referenced the Good Samaritan parable, asking congregations how they could claim to be moral people when 38 of their fellow citizens had failed to show basic human compassion. The story became a touchstone for discussions about Christian duty, civic responsibility, and the erosion of community bonds. Social scientists and psychologists began studying the case with intense interest, recognizing it as a natural experiment in human behavior that revealed disturbing truths about group dynamics and individual moral courage. The phenomenon that emerged from their research would become known as the bystander effect, or Genovese syndrome, the counterintuitive discovery that the presence of multiple witnesses actually decreases the likelihood that any individual will provide help to a victim in distress. The research revealed that the Austin Street witnesses weren't uniquely callous or morally deficient. They were displaying predictable patterns of behavior that could be replicated in laboratory settings. When responsibility is diffused among multiple potential helpers, each individual feels less personal obligation to act. When others are present, people assume someone else will take charge, leading to a paralysis of inaction that can have deadly consequences. This scientific understanding provided little comfort to a nation grappling with what the case revealed about urban alienation and social disconnection. The Kitty Genovese murder became shorthand for everything people feared about city life: the anonymity, the indifference, the breakdown of traditional community bonds that had once made neighbors feel responsible for each other's welfare. Television talk shows featured heated debates about urban morality and civic responsibility. Experts argued about whether the witnesses were victims of social conditioning or moral cowards who had failed a basic test of human decency. The case became a Rorschach test for American anxieties about modernization, urbanization, and the changing nature of community in the 20th century. Politicians seized on the story as evidence, supporting their various agendas. Conservatives argued it demonstrated the moral decay of liberal urban environments, while liberals contended it revealed the dehumanizing effects of poverty, inequality, and social neglect. Everyone seemed to find in the Genovese case confirmation of what they already believed about American society. The impact extended far beyond political and philosophical discussions. Police departments across the country began implementing new emergency response systems designed to make it easier for citizens to report crimes. The 911 emergency system, which had been tested in limited areas, gained new urgency as communities recognized the need for streamlined ways to summon help during crises. Training programs for police dispatchers began emphasizing the importance of taking all calls seriously, recognizing that the Austin Street tragedy might have been prevented if residents had felt confident their concerns would be taken seriously by authorities. The case became a catalyst for reforms in emergency response systems that continue to save lives today. Mental health professionals began studying the long-term effects of witnessing violence without intervening, recognizing that the Austin Street witnesses were themselves traumatized by their experience of moral failure. Many of the 38 people who had watched Kitty Genovese die reported ongoing guilt, depression, and anxiety that persisted for years after the attack. The case also sparked new research into altruistic behavior and moral courage. Psychologists began studying the factors that enable some people to overcome bystander paralysis and act heroically in crisis situations. This research would eventually lead to training programs designed to help people recognize and overcome the psychological barriers that prevent intervention during emergencies. Universities added the Genovese case to their curricula in psychology, sociology, and ethics courses. Students debated what they would have done in similar circumstances, often discovering that their confident assertions about their own moral courage became less certain when examined in the context of social psychology research. The story transcended academic and policy circles to become part of American popular culture. References to Kitty Genovese appeared in novels, films, and television shows as writers grappled with the implications of urban alienation and moral indifference. Her name became synonymous with questions about individual responsibility in an increasingly anonymous society. What's your take on this case? Share your thoughts below and subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, because the next mystery is already ticking. More than 60 years after that March morning in Queens, the name Kitty Genovese continues to echo through psychology textbooks, ethics courses, and discussions about moral courage. What began as a brutal murder in a middle-class neighborhood has evolved into one of the most studied cases in social psychology, fundamentally changing how we understand human behavior in crisis situations. The scientific legacy of Kitty's death emerged from the groundbreaking research of psychologists John Darley and Bibb Latané, who were so disturbed by the Austin Street witnesses in action that they dedicated their careers to understanding why good people fail to help others in emergencies. Their laboratory experiments, beginning in the late 1960s, revealed that the presence of other bystanders creates a powerful psychological phenomenon that inhibits individual action. Their research demonstrated 3 key factors that contribute to bystander apathy: diffusion of responsibility, where individuals assume others will act; social influence, where people look to others for cues about appropriate behavior; and audience inhibition, where the fear of embarrassment or making mistakes prevents intervention. These findings revolutionized our understanding of altruism and moral behavior, showing that situational factors often override individual character in determining who helps and who doesn't. The implications of this research extended far beyond academic psychology. Emergency response systems were redesigned based on bystander effect research, with 911 operators now trained to give specific instructions that overcome diffusion of responsibility. When someone calls about an emergency, dispatchers say, "You need to help this person," rather than "someone should help," directly assigning responsibility to the caller. Medical and emergency training programs now incorporate bystander intervention techniques that specifically address the psychological barriers that prevent people from acting in crises. First aid instructors teach students to point directly at specific individuals and assign them tasks. "You in the red shirt, call 911," or "You by the door, Find a defibrillator. Techniques derived directly from research inspired by Kitty's case. The military and law enforcement have adopted similar strategies, recognizing that even trained professionals can fall victim to bystander paralysis in chaotic situations. Modern tactical training emphasizes clear command structures and individual accountability to prevent the kind of collective inaction that proved so deadly on Austin Street. But Kitty's legacy extends beyond emergency response into broader questions about civic engagement and social responsibility. Urban planners now consider community design elements that foster neighborly interaction and mutual concern. The isolated apartment living that characterized Austin Street in 1964 has given way to mixed-use developments that encourage residents to know each other and feel invested in their community's welfare. Social media has created new dimensions to the bystander effect, with viral videos of violence or distress sometimes viewed by millions who feel no personal responsibility to intervene. The same psychological mechanisms that prevented the Austin Street witnesses from calling police now play out on digital platforms where people share, comment, and scroll past human suffering without taking action. Yet technology has also provided new tools for overcoming bystander paralysis. Smartphone apps allow witnesses to report crimes instantly, often with photo and video evidence. Social media can mobilize communities to help victims and identify perpetrators in ways that were impossible in 1964. The same connectivity that can promote apathy also creates unprecedented opportunities for collective action. Educational initiatives have emerged directly from lessons learned from Kitty's case. Anti-bullying programs teach children to recognize bystander paralysis and overcome it through specific intervention techniques. Sexual assault prevention programs on college campuses focus heavily on bystander intervention, recognizing that potential witnesses often have more power to prevent crimes than the victims themselves. The legal system has also grappled with questions raised by the Genovese case. Some jurisdictions have enacted duty to rescue, laws that create legal obligations to assist people in peril, though these remain controversial and difficult to enforce. More commonly, Good Samaritan laws have been strengthened to protect people who do intervene from legal liability, removing one barrier to helping behavior. Winston Moseley, the man who destroyed Kitty's life, remained in prison until his death in 2016, becoming New York's longest-serving inmate. His capture and conviction provided justice for Kitty's family, but could never undo the broader damage his crime had revealed about American society. His life behind bars became a footnote to a case that transcended individual criminal justice to illuminate fundamental questions about human nature. Recent scholarship has challenged some details of the original New York Times reporting, suggesting that the number of witnesses who had clear views of the attack may have been smaller than initially reported. However, these corrections haven't diminished the psychological and social insights that emerged from studying the case. The bystander effect remains a well-documented phenomenon that continues to influence how we understand moral behavior. Today, Kitty Genovese is remembered not just as a murder victim, but as someone whose death catalyzed decades of research that has saved countless lives. Training programs for healthcare workers, teachers, police officers, and ordinary citizens incorporate lessons learned from studying why her neighbors failed to save her. Her tragedy became the foundation for understanding how to build more responsive, caring communities. The questions raised by that March morning in Queens remain as relevant today as they were in 1964. In an age of increasing social isolation and digital connection, we still struggle with when and how to intervene when strangers need help. The courage to act when others remain passive is still rare and precious. Kitty Genovese's legacy challenges each of us to examine our own capacity for moral courage and civic engagement. Her death asks uncomfortable questions about what kind of neighbors we choose to be, what responsibilities we have to strangers in distress, and whether we will act when our action might save a life. In the end, the true measure of Kitty's legacy may not be the research papers written about her case or the policy changes implemented in response to it, but the individual moments when someone remembers her story and chooses courage over comfort, action over apathy, involvement over indifference. Her name has become synonymous with both the worst and best of human nature, the capacity for collective moral failure, and the potential for individual heroism that can overcome it. As long as people face moments that demand moral courage, Kitty Genovese's story will continue to echo, asking each of us what we would do when someone cries out in the darkness, hoping that this time, someone will answer.